Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kim Ricketts, and I'm here to introduce and welcome Daniel Goleman, who is visiting us as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Dan Goleman is here today to discuss ecological intelligence, how knowing the hidden impacts of what we buy can change everything. There are inconsistencies between how we feel and what we do when it comes to the environmental crisis. We recycle like Seattleites and yet drive miles to purchase groceries. We take bags into the store with us, yet we buy fruits that have been shipped from across the globe. With the new generation of technologies, we can access the ecological truths about any product before we buy it, enabling us to make smarter purchasing decisions, which in turn will drive companies to rethink and reform their business practices. Daniel Goleman is the author of several international bestsellers, including Emotional Intelligence and Primal Leadership. A former science reporter for the New York Times, Goleman has twice been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize and received the American Psychological Association's Lifetime Achievement Award. He was elected a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in recognition of his efforts to communicate the behavioral sciences to the general public. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Goleman back to Microsoft to discuss ecological intelligence, how knowing the hidden impacts of what we buy can change everything.
Thanks very much. Good to be here again. Actually, what I want to talk about is how information science can save the world, and I mean it. This is not a joke. You need to know about some new science, some new data that can be manipulated in ways, displayed in ways, shared in ways that can make each of us an active agent in stopping, putting the brakes on global warming and a large range of other crises that have to do with what you and I set in motion every time we go to the store. Let me ask you, I know this is Seattle, so how many people here recycle? It has to be everybody, right? Is it a law here or something? I've never had 100% of hands go up in any audience anywhere. But what about other things? Do you print on both sides of the paper? Really? That's good. What other things do you do for, environmental goodness? I'd just like to know, yeah.
Bicycle.
You ride a bike? Great.
Walk.
You walk?
Take the bus.
Take the bus?
Turn the lights off.
Say?
Turn the lights off.
Turn the lights off that you don't need.
Home automation control, turn off all the lights.
Home automation control, turn off all the lights.
Eat vegetarian?
Eat vegetarian. Okay, all of that is to the good. But I have to tell you that is all last century. I want to tell you what's coming for this century. Because think about it. We have been told that we have to reform how we behave in order to help things along. But let me share some data with you. I believe you probably like data here, so we'll start there. Anybody eat Stonyfield yogurt? Stonyfield yogurt? Comes out of Maine, but it's actually okay to eat it here in Seattle too. Stonyfield commissioned a friend of mine who you're going to meet, Gregory Norris, who's one of the people leading this information revolution, asked him, look at the entire life cycle of our yogurt and tell us where in the, from cows being milked on farms in New Hampshire and fruit being grown who knows where that's going to be in the cup, to manufacturing and trucking and time in store and so on. Where are our impacts for global warming? So how many people, after you finish yogurt, recycle the thing? It has to be 100%, right? Everybody does that? So how much of the total impact on environmental warming do you think that act has? Just a guess, anybody? 5%. Anyone else? 1%, 3%. 3%. 30%. 5% is right. How did you know that? Oh, you had the book. So that's exactly right. But think about that. If that means 95% of the global warming impacts are elsewhere in the life story of that can or that jar of yogurt. So we've been told This is why this is so 20th century. We've been told, well, the great thing we can do is to change our behavior. It's all true. That helps a bit. But if we were to take, each one of us were to take the sum total of the positive ecological impacts of all of the good things we do and put that in one hand, and then to put on the other hand the sum total of the negative impacts of the stuff we buy and own, it would be magnitudes of order greater in the other direction. And this is where we've got to move. This is where we have to go, is into taking control over the impacts of the things we buy, and what we need to do that is an information revolution. And the good news that I want to share with you is that this is coming. However, before I get there, I have to give you a heads up. I'm going to give you some bad news and then some worse news, but bear with me, then there will be better news and even better news. So the science that Greg Norris uses is from a discipline called industrial ecology. Industrial ecology studies the impacts of human systems on natural systems, industry and commerce, manufacturing particularly. How does the stuff we make, the stuff we buy, the stuff we use, impact the ecosystems that we operated in? And it's a very fine-grained science. It yields a new math, a kind of ecological accounting. If you look at a glass jar, like pasta sauce comes in, industrial ecologists break down that glass jar into not a product, but the processes involved. They look at 1,959 discrete steps in the life story of that. And at each step, they assay the environmental impacts. I don't mean just global warming, but what's emitted into air, water, soil, so on. They look at the health impacts, and this has to do with the fact that there are 100,000 industrial chemicals in use today, 62,000 of which were grandfathered in as presumably non-toxic when the EPA was created. They're not non-toxic. So they look at that, and they look at social impacts. What were the conditions of the people who worked there? And they do that for each one of those steps. So this is a huge mass of data that has been collected over the last 10 to 20 years. It's sitting there, and it needs to be deployed. And maybe some of you can help, I don't know. But let me give you more of the big picture. So Greg did an analysis of the Dutch power grid using another unit. Greg teaches at the Harvard School of Public Health. The unit is called a disability-adjusted life year. What does that mean? It means how many years of your life was lost to a disease or disability as a result of this chemical, that exposure, et cetera, et cetera. And he looked on the one hand at the negative impact, particularly respiratory disease, for people in the Netherlands because of emissions from coal plants and so on, versus looking at the 10% of the supply chain for that power grid that's in the poorest part of the world, the benefits, because factories are giving people jobs, better nutrition for kids, education, health. And when he weighed those two things together and did the math, he found that the benefits from giving people work in the poorest part of the world far outweighed the negatives to the people in the Netherlands. In other words, this look at industrial processes, at things, gives us an entirely new way to evaluate them and to think about them. Greg and I wrote an editorial, actually an op-ed in the New York Times, and it was on this question. Is it better to have a stainless steel water bottle that you reuse or to get throwaway plastic ones? And at the beginning, if you're looking at just the plastic and just the steel, which do you think is worse, plastic or steel? Plastic? Actually, steel has the worst ecological impact because stainless steel, particularly some of the strong impacts come from the fact that stainless is made from an alloy of nickel and chromium. Chrome, which is carcinogenic, is mined in countries like Kazakhstan, India, South Africa, where miners are not well protected from that exposure. Another problem with steel is to make this, you've got to heat it to a very high degree for a long, long time. It's extremely energy intensive and what's spewed into the atmosphere and so on. However, by the 5th time you replace a throwaway with stainless, you start to tip toward the steel. My wife gave this to me last week. I've been carrying it with me on this tour I'm on, and I'm up to 23 plastic bottles. By 23 or so, 25, all of the bad environmental impacts now favor steel. In other words, you've replaced so many that's taken care of. By 500, you take care of everything. The last two to go are ecotoxicity in water, and this is really interesting, metal depletion. Where is the metal, I ask you, in a plastic bottle? Right, there is none. It's in the supply chain. And what this math does is look at a product in terms of its, not just the industrial processes used, but let's say with glass, you need soda ash to mix in with the silica before you heat it 2,000 degrees for 24 hours. Well, let's look at soda ash. They go into the supply chain for soda ash. They go into the supply chain for the components of soda ash. In other words, this math looks at the reality of things. It looks at the full story. Everything that was needed for this gets weighted here. So you get a picture of the total ecological impact, and we have never had that information before this science emerged. And that, in fact, here's our great dilemma. Everything made today for us, maybe not everything, but 98% perhaps, was the process by which it was made was developed at a time when we were naive, in fact ignorant of ecological impacts at this level. That means we have a huge legacy of industrial platforms, industrial chemicals, industrial design, habits of industry and commerce that are terrible, it turns out. But that's the legacy we have to work with. In fact, what this means is now that we are no longer innocent to that, now that we know the impacts, we have to reinvent everything. We have to come up with a palette of industrial chemicals that aren't toxins to us or to something in nature. We have to come up with manufacturing processes that mimic nature, in fact. We have to rethink everything. If you look in this room through the eyes of an industrial ecologist, it's a disaster, I'm sorry. If you look at a LEED certified building through the eyes of industrial ecologists, it's a disaster. Why is it a disaster? Well, LEED, is the best kind of environmental building, right? Hey, come on, it's made out of concrete. Well, what about concrete? The way we make concrete was developed in 1825, folks. We take limestone and we throw in some other stuff and we cook it at high temperatures for 24 hours. That's insane. You know what we're doing? We're killing ourselves with our stuff. Our stuff is, there's a new book out called Death by Rubber Ducky. It's about the fact that we're killing ourselves. That's about the chemicals in the stuff. But we have to re-understand the material universe and use information systems to get it better. Little more bad news before we get to the good news. Our neural alarm circuit for threat evolved to recognize a very narrow range of danger. Snarling animals, putrid, poisonous, disgusting foods. In modern life, honey, we have to talk, things like that. So what that means is that the real dangers we face are imperceptible to us. We have no direct way of knowing that, for example, when we go snorkeling to a coral reef, a chemical in our sunblock is being washed off into the reef, promoting the growth of a virus that kills the reef. We don't know that. We don't know. Here's one that really upsets me. I have grandchildren. Phthalates, which are used to soften plastics and are carcinogens, are in what? Well, one thing they're in, which we really should rethink quickly, is IV bags in hospitals. The other thing that we should rethink is water wings. Because it turns out that phthalates penetrates skin most effectively that's wet. In other words, we don't know what we're doing to ourselves, and we better find out quickly and do something about it. And the something that we can do has to do with two new information systems. There's the book which describes them. This dialogue, this set of CDs goes into them in more depth with each of the developers. But one of them is called Good Guide, G-U-I-D-E, not Good Guy, goodguide.com. Goodguide.com aggregates 200 databases and presents it to the user as a 10-point scale. 10 is good, 1 is terrible, and it analyzes products in 3 domains of impact: environmental, health, and social. So if you look at Stonyfield yogurt, if you look up yogurts, 9 of the 10 positions, top 10 positions are Stonyfield. There's something called Horizon Organic Yogurt. Well, Horizon Organic Yogurt, gee, is this going out? Oh. Never mind. Never mind. There's a certain yogurt that looks very green and good, as do many products, which actually, once you know the LCA story about it, turns out to be not so great. In fact, what we have thought up as green is a mirage. If you look at any product that is marketed as green through an LCA lens, you realize there are 1,000 impacts. You improve one thing and you call it green, but hey, what about the other 999? And to boot, then they charge premium because it's better. But that's that's a complete smoke and mirrors. I bought an organic T-shirt. That's nice, organic, right? It's virtuous. Well, then you learn a little more. It turns out organic cotton fibers are shorter than other cotton fibers, so they have to grow more cotton to make the same T-shirt. Cotton is a very thirsty crop. It takes about 2,500 liters of water, or gallons of water, to grow the cotton for one T-shirt. Often cotton is grown in water-thirsty areas. The Aral Sea in Asia is a pond now because of cotton plantations. The dye in the T-shirt, it's a nice blue T-shirt. Most textile dyes are carcinogens. Cotton does not absorb dye well. Most of the dye washes off into wastewater. It's been known for a long time in public health that people who work in dye houses have higher rates of leukemia. So how great is that T-shirt? How great is anything that we call green now? What we need to do instead is to start looking at the total ecological footprint of stuff, of anything we buy, and make better choices. Because by doing that, we can start getting companies to make changes we need. We can basically use the free market to actually accelerate the move to sustainability. How does it start? I was at a friend's house down in the Bay Area, and we're having dinner, and I was talking about Good Guide, and the 14-year-old immediately got on the family entertainment center, the big screen in the kitchen, goodguide.com, and we played a little game. We looked up stuff. Look up my deodorant. Look up my shampoo. And all of a sudden, we started realizing, oh my God, we've got to change. At the end of about a half hour of look up this, look up that, we all piled in the car, went down to Walgreens and bought new stuff. But that's what each one of us has to do. We need to do 3 things. 1, know the impacts of what you buy. 2, favor improvements. And 3, share what you know. That will make us ecologically intelligent again. We used to be, when we lived in traditional cultures and adapted to ecosystems. We stopped that when we started the Industrial Revolution. We've got to get back to it, but we need this information prosthetic because our brain doesn't have the circuitry for it. So Good Guide and systems like that can help us when we go to the store vote with our dollars for a better world, and that will make a difference because companies want our business. Good Guide has a single-click feature that lets you email the company and say, I used to love your X. I bought it for years, but now I found out this about it, and I'm not going to buy it unless you change. Good Guide also does something very smart. It waits till it gets 500 of those for a given company, and then it sends them all at once. Because if companies get 3 or 4 complaints, it's handled at a very low level. If they get 500, it's reviewed at the top C level. That makes a difference. The other thing is that this can change the debate within companies about sustainability. Companies say we need to be sustainable. First of all, there are low-lying fruits. You can get a lot of quick savings by getting more efficient energy sources and so on, but also they say it's the socially responsible thing to do. However, then other voices in the company say, yes, but our first responsibility is fiduciary. We have to make a profit. We can't do this till there's a strong business case. There's not going to be a strong business case till you and I and everybody we know start shopping this way with good information, favoring better ecological products, because with this other information system you're going to hear about shortly, that can create a perpetual upgrade where companies will be examining their supply chain, like Procter & Gamble did LCAs of its entire product line to see what's our worst contribution to global warming. You know what it is? It's because we have to warm water, heat water, to use their detergents. So what they do, they went to their R&D and the labs and had them develop cold water detergents that they say are as effective as the hot water. We have to get that kind of thinking about everything. And the way we do it is showing that that's what we want. That's what we'll buy. We won't buy the other stuff. Greg's information system is for supply chain management, using LCA data to help companies that want to do something better, find suppliers that will give them that. This will accelerate the process, and you're going to hear about this system shortly from Greg. So just in closing, let me say that if folks like you who know information science, know information systems, have the ability to do this kind of thing, will help the rest of us do this better, get to the next stage in what we need to be doing to save the planet from, you know who the biggest threat is to our planet, right? We're sitting right here. And we have known not what we do, as they say. Now we know, and we have to do it differently, but we need good information. So Greg, would you come up and talk about how companies can manage this?
Thanks very much to Dan for inviting me, and to the folks here for inviting Dan so I could come do an outrageous thing, which I'm not sure is truly happening. I'm about to give a talk about data and software to Microsoft. Until I wake up, I'm just going to keep going. And share some ideas. And as Dan said, there's a ton of work in this area, and so it's exciting, especially to be here and see what can come of it in terms of collaboration opportunities and so on. To switch to the PowerPoint presentation.
Yep, you got
Maybe
it.
I'll just click. Oh, there, it's up there. Good. Okay, and I think here's where we go. Dan has shared a lot of things with you in a short amount of time, and one of them, at the center of it, one of the good news piece, I guess, at the center of the good news is the Good Guide. And the Good Guide, just like cotton is very thirsty for water, the Good Guide is extremely thirsty for data. And since about 2004, I've been working with a small team to develop kind of the hidden back end of this, through which companies can report to one another and can generate information that eventually flows to sources like the Good Guide, which make it usable at the point of sale and by decision makers who can change everything. So these life cycle assessment databases that Dan talked about, where we have thousands of these building blocks, what we call those building blocks is unit processes. And each one of these unit processes, like a factory producing something, or this might even be a very detailed engineering step within a larger factory, is modeled as a linear input-output system with these four kinds of flows. So there's a product or service output, and services count too, by the way. They're inputs purchased from all other systems in the economy. So inputs of materials and energy, but potentially also equipment and also services. A few processes actually extract resources directly from nature. So if we're using water on site, if we're a tree harvesting operation, then there's input from nature. And finally, releases to the environment in the forms of all kinds of pollution to air, water, and land. Also, incidentally, we look at land use, and even noise is addressed by some kinds of life cycle assessment. And then we connect those blocks. So here's a portrait of a very small portion of a system, actually for a laptop computer. So those are some of the major components into a laptop computer, and each of those comes from another process and another process. And when you ask the software that I use to generate these portraits to look at the whole system, it says, well, you're only going to see 13 out of 1,500 and some, and you can change the scale. But one important thing that we do in life cycle assessment, after you've got thousands of these unit processes, to get to a bottom line, we sum up the flows across the whole system to get to a total. So all of the releases of each chemical by every process over the whole system are summed up chemical by chemical, and you get a long vector of flows, maybe 600, 700 in length, of what quantity of each flow is going to the environment or from the environment per laptop computer or per shopping bag, per t-shirt, etc. That's an unwieldy result, right? 1,000 flows or 600 pollution flows. So we need to translate that into something of more meaning to a decision maker. So for example, we'll take all the global warming gases and sum them up in terms of a carbon equivalent, a CO2 equivalent, which tells us how much warming we can expect. Or at least it equates all the gases in terms of their relative potential to cause warming over a duration of time like 100 years. We'll do the same thing for all the carcinogens and sum it up to cancer risk, sum up aquatic ecotoxicity, and so forth. So I like to think of that as a focusing lens where, again, we started over here with 1,000 unit processes or 2,000. We've got a vector of flows, which is that footprint. We focus it down with a lens into a set of impact scores, and that's basically the point at which this system of analysis called life cycle assessment hands its information over to the good guide, and they translate it into a final score. And the science continuously evolves in that lens. But how do we get the data? Up until this point in time, my work has looked a lot like the screen on the left there, and so have the lives of the companies that I've been asked to go do surveys of. Right? We basically arrive and say, "Give us your data." The companies don't understand potentially why they're being asked for this information. They're not sure how to gather it, but they eventually get around to it. Fill out the questionnaires, and we go back and we average across maybe 5 factories, 5 paper mills, 5 production facilities or more, and produce an industry average. And now we've added one page to this long database. I think a good analogy is the difference between Encyclopedia Britannica on the left and Wikipedia on the right. So, and I'll explain how we got to this new idea in a moment. But basically, in the old style, which is still the mainstream approach, it's a researcher or an analyst who's asking a production facility for the data, and the production facility is not really engaged in a business sense. On the right, you have the fact that usage is in the driver's seat. It's the user of the information who's entering the data in the first place, and publishing or authoring with that data is optional. And I'll explain what that means. as Dan mentioned, in about 8 years ago or so, I started doing that work to look at what are the health consequences of the economic development in supply chains. And I found, as Dan said, that we could have 1,000-fold greater positive benefit in just a small fraction of the supply chain with economic development. The caveat is if the economic development is done well, meaning that it leads to increased investment in education and in sanitation, among other things. But as I presented those results and did some more research about it, I got really concerned that this could be just used as a rubber stamp for, economic growth of any sort. We've got new production occurring in a developing country, must be 1,000 times better than the pollution. Of course, the answer to that is absolutely not necessarily at all. The development is very potent, and it turns out it's so much about local details that matter. So I asked myself at that point, how can we facilitate ubiquitous reporting across the supply chain? In fact, I really wanted to facilitate bottom-up reporting where the local reporters determine their own metrics, and yet at the end of the day we somehow aggregate across the supply chain. And I was doing some work with facilitating community reporting and content management systems and things of that nature, and that led to the development of Earthster. After we've started working on Earthster, we soon saw that this could be really powerful when applied to environmental information in supply chains as well. So any company can log into Earthster for free and basically conduct what we call Cradle-To-Gate life cycle assessment, or we can calculate your footprint using life cycle assessment data. You just define your unit process the way I just described on an earlier slide. You specify your purchases, your emissions, your extract inflows from nature, and your product output. Now, by the way, you use this data on your own computer. You don't send it up to a website, because anytime we ask companies to report their purchase quantities per unit of output, forget it. That's confidential information. Instead, what Earthster does is it uses that information. It links to the best available data on the purchases to compute that footprint vector. Remember, that vector is the sum over the whole supply chain of thousands of processes. And it's really tough, I would say usually impossible, to know much of anything about the detailed inputs to my process when I provide the final vector of flows over the whole supply chain. A company at that point can learn what are the major impacts. Stonyfield Farms yogurt at that point can find out that recycling is 5% and dairy products are 80% and fruit is 10% and so forth. That gives them information on which to act. They can also do what-if analysis, compare two suppliers, compare different types of input, and so on. But the next important step is, remember, the user is potentially an author. So at this point, they can decide to publish their Cradle-To-Gate inventory into the web. If they do that, they've provided information into the marketplace so that their footprint can be compared and their product can be compared versus other products in the same sector. And the most exciting thing is, if I can do this, so can my supplier. So now, rather than link to average data, industry average data, if my supplier is for some reason better than average in the product that they're producing and I use their product to make mine, I should link to their data rather than linking to industry average. Once we do that, and we recalculate and we republish for free, essentially this very static, relatively static process of life cycle assessment becomes real time. And I think the potential for feedback loops to exponentially grow both the level of activity here and also the results of LCA are, just as Dan mentions, there are a lot of potent feedback loops. Just to name a few, first of all, if I've got information linked in my supply chain, I can come in on Monday morning and find out that my product is greener than it was on Friday afternoon because somewhere in the supply chain someone has updated the data and it's flowing through to my product. And secondly, over the course of a year, I can really document the progress, and in fact we could begin to compare companies in terms of progress that they're making on the impacts that matter most, rather than just picking one parameter. And as Dan sometimes says, we need to focus on green as a verb rather than green as an adjective. And I couldn't agree more. There's another feedback loop here, and that is between company-specific data and these databases that we need. As soon as 3 manufacturers of some product have gathered the on-site data, that information can be aggregated to create an updated average for their product. And so industry-specific, company-specific, and generic data can fuel each other. Now, as we launch into this, and basically as the world discovers life cycle assessment, and I think Dan has a huge, is playing a huge role in this all of a sudden, I've been recently asked the question, what are the key characteristics of solutions in this space? And if I had to boil it down to just one word, I would say openness, which is an easy word to throw out there, but I would say that is an absolutely key concept. And there's 2 ways in which these systems can be open. One is in terms of the data, and the other is in terms of the software utilities themselves. Now, clearly, companies have to be able to preserve confidential information. But when I say openness, I mean openness of the industry average data that's used. That should be transparently visible to everyone so that we can all double check it. And secondly, the Cradle-To-Gate footprints of every company should be visible to everyone, just like price is, so that we can find the lowest price solution. We should be able to find the lowest environmental cost solution or the lowest social cost solution. And people who care most about social should be able to emphasize that more than people who care most about ecological. So the information needs to be transparent and shareable. And I think universally web accessible. I frankly think this is an ideal application for the semantic web. It doesn't have to be semantic web. It could be stored in web accessible databases. But why not post the data with markup and machine readability and use the semantic web for this? Extensibility is important because just during my last decade of working in LCA, I've seen the data itself, the data structures themselves and the flows we track evolve. And I'm sure they'll continue to evolve. So we need an ability for new researchers to come forward and say, hey, here's a flow that matters, or here's another attribute of products that we need to report. And I think modularity of the applications is going to be key because different users have different needs. But the basic functions that I foresee at the moment, and we can all see at the moment, are we need applications that can read from this data resource in the web, can help users make sense of it, you know, find an optimal supplier of something depending on what they care about, create their own reports. So that's going to be drawing from company databases on what we purchased and what we emitted and what we produced in order to generate the unit process descriptions, and then publishing to the semantic web or to the web accessible databases. So just to wrap up and turn it back to Dan, the trends that I see are that more and more actors in the economy essentially want to know more and more about the economy. They want to know more. We all want to know more and more about the impacts of the things we buy far afield. On us, yes, but also on different issues and different people all over the globe. Companies want that information, and so do consumers. And of course, human beings, we want to heal in many senses. We want to protect ourselves and our grandchildren from phthalates, etc. We also want to help workers in other countries achieve basic human rights and ideally become able to thrive, and we certainly want to heal the environment. So the solutions that are going to thrive themselves in the presence of these fundamental, I'd say, human urges, or maybe even more deeply we could say life urges, are those that empower these urges. And the more empowering of free action in this space technology can be, the more successfully it's going to be used, I think. Thanks.
Why don't you stay right here?
Okay.
Basically, we're talking about, from a kind of meta point of view, in terms of economic theory, we've had a situation of information asymmetry. That means sellers know things buyers don't. Think the current meltdown in the economy was because of a huge information asymmetry. Subprime mortgage-based derivatives, what were those? They were nothing, but huge amounts of money went into them. So just like there are toxic assets, we need to think toxic goods, because we've known nothing till now. Now that we know it, it opens a huge range of opportunity for innovation to change things for the better. So I'd love to hear from you. Any questions, any thoughts on what we said? Yes?
One quick question on what you're talking about. You talk about Cradle-To-Gate. I love what you've done with it. It seems a little bit incomplete, though, because that's not the complete life cycle of the product. I mean, things that we are considering are, you know, what do you do after the product? And for example, PCs, people are throwing away the cases. When actually, reality, they're actually buying an upgraded processor, an updated hard drive, and perhaps a new video card. Well, what would it be like if they didn't throw the case away and they had user replaceable modules to upgrade the machines, but you didn't throw away the power supply, you didn't throw away the... But in some of these cases, the Cradle-To-Gate doesn't necessarily give credit for the renewable nature of at least certain elements of those components.
You're absolutely right. Cradle-To-Gate, and I'm really glad you're asking that question. So Cradle-To-Gate is just one of the building blocks. It's an essential building block to the full assessment, but it's only the start. We up until the point of manufacture, we need to know that. But then to get a final decision, we need the full life cycle story. And I won't quote statistics, it's just absolutely true for many products. And computers are a good example, where half the burden, roughly speaking, is in the manufacture for a laptop, and half of it's during the use phase. In order to assess two options from a use point of view, it's a much more complex assessment where we have to get into something called functional equivalence. You know, I need to make sure that I'm comparing two functionally equivalent products. And my quick answer to this is that too needs to be done in the web. Right now it's done in the form of reports and analyses by consultants like myself and researchers. We publish reports, we get them peer reviewed under ISO standards for peer review, but they're not living documents and they're not fully scrutinizable by the next person who comes along to use the information. So we actually have a proposal out that we hope we hear back on in the next week or two, to create something that is a three-part system: the life cycle calculator, which is you can actually build a full cradle-to-grave assessment in the web; the life cycle whiteboard, by which other people can come in and say, that's nice, but what if they assume this instead of that? And the life cycle library, where you can move a study from sort of beta status or provisional status, do an ISO peer review on it, and move it to a bookshelf, and also do meta-analyses across 3 different LCAs to draw out kind of robust conclusions. It's true we need that too.
Just another quick comment. We're really talking about a radical transparency here. And one of the key features of, for example, Good Guide is that although it has a very user-friendly face, anyone can drill down into the data. Why did you evaluate it that way? And with LCAs, you can't publish an LCA data until it's been peer-reviewed. Verifiability is absolutely essential if this is going to work. And the other thing I would add to your wonderful modular idea, 2 things, which is one of the targets is industrial nutrients being used. That is, every substance used in something made industrially either completely biodegrades or can be completely used in something of the same quality in a new product, life after life, that idea. The other is, in addition to that, what about brominated fire retardants? Electronics are permeated with them. The cabinetry is, they off-gas, they're carcinogens. They get into our house dust. I just saw a study reported last week. They get into us. Why aren't we also thinking in terms of that? And I think with this transparency and understanding the impacts, the toxicity of what we own and use will also become part of the equation.
How do these approaches work in an extremely large scale output, like say the daily output of a coal mine? I frankly am more interested in that than in the daily output of Stonyfield yogurt. Because it's spewing an awful lot into our environment compared to yogurt cups.
So absolutely, a coal mine is another unit process. Well, a coal-fired power plant is another unit process in the database. In fact, maybe this is a time to mention, I had an interesting experience. I went back to grad school one more time to do my doctorate on environment and sustainability because that was my passion. And there was a coal-fired power plant down the street, and I always thought that's, sort of, I didn't think this consciously, but sort of subconscious way the bad guys lived there or worked there, right? It was, look at those polluters with their coal plant. And for some reason, I never mentioned this to my advisor, but I was studying energy planning, and my advisor at the time said, I think we should visit that coal plant. I don't know why he said that, but so we visited the evil empire of the coal plant, and lo and behold, there's friendly guys with hard hats, and maybe some women too, just trying to keep the equipment moving so that when I turn on my light switch, I get electricity. I couldn't find a bad guy anywhere. And I think it was pretty instructive that, we've met the enemy. I try to think of it much more positively. We've met the person with leverage, and it is us. So the coal-fired power plant is in there, but it's just that there's a chain going to the power plant that we can.
Let me give you another example that illustrates how Earthster works. There's a company called Fibermark. It has a plant in Brattleboro, Vermont, and they make packaging. A lot of the products you buy are packaged with Fibermark packaging products, and they used to be oil-powered, making their fiberboard. A year or two ago, they started sending an empty truck down to New York City to gather used cooking oil, and now they use the cooking oil. The improvement in impacts from that ripples through the supply chain and goes to the credit of every product now that uses their packaging. So that's where we want to go. I think you're right. The coal mine is part of the problem, but it's part of a total solution using the free market. Government is good too if we can regulate, but using the free market to require that in order to stay competitive, companies need to use ecological footprints as a measure of value of the product, not just price. Now, in fact, I have heard from very large retailers that they foresee a day when products will compete for shelf space in their stores on the basis of ecological footprints. And that will really move things.
Maybe just to get at one last thread of his question that I missed. If I'm making a product, I can use life cycle assessment to figure out the importance of the coal-fired power plant in the footprint. And if I find out that it is a significant part of the problem, that gives me the information I need to say, to wherever it is in my supply chain, let's get green power into that situation. Exactly. So I know where the key problems are and how to solve them.
Kim, how much time do we have?
I'd say we can go till 2:30 for the questions.
2:30? Okay, so there are 1, 2, 3, 4 questions, and we have 6 minutes, but we'll hang around. So if you have other questions, that's fine. Yes?
Yeah, I think all this would work in the first world where people can really work websites. What about places like India, Bangladesh, where you need more government regulation?
Well, I think that this system actually can have effects in places like India and Bangladesh. I've lived 2 years in India. I first lived in 1970, when India was basically a vast sea of poverty with a thin layer of affluence. Now it has a robust middle class. As people move into, even within poor developing countries, move into income levels where they have discretion over what they buy, they too want to protect their kids. They too want the product that doesn't have the toxins. So it will help there. But the other is, when we ask that companies use, say, green energy rather than the coal plant, that has to be responded to in China. In other words, the suppliers are in the poorest countries, And their market is in the richest countries. And if the richest countries are saying, we don't like that kind of supply chain anymore, we want you to reform, then it'll ripple through there. Those are the two strategies. Maybe you see another aspect of this.
To your point, like in the 70s, India ecologically was more balanced. Then even though the affluence is there, but now it's not. It's completely Coca-Cola.
I know.
Like
I remember when I was there, you'd buy a bag of peanuts and it was wrapped in a kid's school paper that had been scored. Yeah. I know. It's very ironic, that situation. Yes?
Why are you using the myth of the free market?
The what?
The myth.
The myth of the free market.
When companies either mandate or deregulate, it seems like those are the citizens of the world now, and human beings are relegated to consumers rather than citizens. We get about it in the news. So, is this still?
Well, no, I actually think that that when we have information, we get power over companies, and if we share what we know and we get other people to do, well, they only have power because they sell stuff to us. If they can't sell stuff to us, they're nothing. So I think that what it does is empower people to regain citizenry, regain real power, if we use this well. Yes?
How does transportation fit into this chart you showed me of import and output?
Transport is another unit process. So each leg of transportation is part of the it is captured, all the significant legs of transportation are captured in that supply chain. So out of that 1,600 and some, there'll be ocean transport many different times, there'll be trucking many different times, rail, etc. A little bit of maybe LCA engineering for you. We typically treat the transport of the goods as another one of the service inputs to each unit process. So that's where it's captured numerically.
One last question, yes.
How confident are you that the LCA provides good data? Because the response may be too little, or processes change, suppliers change every other week. So how does it work?
That's huge. So first of all, uncertainty analysis has been introduced into some of these databases, and the software that we use is Monte Carlo capable, so we can estimate the uncertainty on the outputs reasonably well. There are sources of uncertainty throughout this, and as you say, one of the issues has been change. One of the issues is rapid technological change or shifts in suppliers, shifts in production function. That's something we're just missing with our static databases that get updated every 2 years. That's something I think we can capture much better with when the information is flowing in real time. But uncertainty analysis is really a key part of the technical solution here as well. And we need to be able to know when the right answer to a consumer is too close to call. So, choose the one that you like better, because until we get better information, this is fuzzy. And, in the Good Guide, the Good Guide is very explicit about places where companies are not reporting. So you get a real bad score on disclosure. And that's another important vehicle.
Which, of course, to the extent the system does move markets, matters more and more. Clorox and SC Johnson, for the first time in more than 100 years, 2 weeks ago disclosed the ingredients in their household cleaners. 2 weeks ago. It can happen. I think we reached the end of our hour. Thank you very much.